Okay, now we are ready. Please welcome Hanno Böck, who will talk about the HTTP GET attack.
Yeah. So hello. Yeah. Yeah. As said, I am going to talk about the HTTP GET attack, or what things you can find on web servers out there. Um, so I want to introduce a very powerful hack tool to you. It's called wget. So here's an article from the New York Times about it was about the Snowden case, but here they mentioned that Chelsea Manning actually used wget to get the data that was later leaked through WikiLeaks. So it seems we have a very interesting tool here. So I want to talk about hacking with wget. I want to state a few things which may seem obvious, but maybe they aren't. So if you put files in the web root of your web server, then other people can download them. That's kind of what the web server is for, right? And if those files contain secret information, then maybe that's not so good. And that's the HTTP GET attack. That's everything I'm going to talk about. We're downloading files from web servers. So you probably all know Git, right? I mean, Git is the standard tool to manage source code. And some people also use Git to develop web pages and manage the files of their web pages and deploy the web pages to their servers. You probably also know every Git repository has this .git directory, which contains kind of the repository data, which is some configuration file and also in a kind of hashed version all the files in the repository, including the history of the repository. So what you can do is you can see if there are web pages out there that use Git and have such a .git directory, and this .git/config file is always present in every Git directory. And there are also tools to scrape such a Git directory, because like you can find the top commit ID, and from there you can kind of traverse through the older commits. It doesn't always work perfectly, but usually you get enough information to be interesting. And of course, if people use this to deploy their web pages, they may also deploy configuration files with API keys, with passwords, or things like that. Do you know the Volksverschlüsselung? I think a few Germans are here that probably heard of it. So it is kind of a project which is in Germany, which is supported by the government and developed by Fraunhofer Institute, where they want to provide encrypted email for people. It's basically S/MIME, but incompatible with other S/MIME. There are a lot of interesting stories to tell about it. For example, they announced that they will make their software open source, and then some people read their license and said that's not open source, and then they kind of said, yeah, it's open source, but under our own definition of open source, not the generally accepted definition of open source. And they also used Git to deploy their web page. And had exactly that problem and for example, they used the password Safran, which a colleague of mine said that doesn't comply with general advice for secure passwords, which was stored in their Git repository for a database. They said in a statement that this password was not used in production. I don't know if that's true, but okay, that's, yeah. Yeah, obviously the very same attack works for all kinds of other source code management systems, because this general concept that you have one directory which contains all the repository data is common among basically all usual source code management systems. So you can of course also scan for .svn, .hg, or CVS, or whatever source code management system. Apache server status pages. So Apache has a feature that you can enable a status module, and then you can call the web server with /server status, like that, and it gives you status information about the currently running server. So it tells you things like the server load, it tells you the IP addresses of current visitors, and also the URLs that visitors requested. And some people make them public. For example, Ask.com, it's a search engine. And a search engine, so this was interesting because like it shows the URL, so you can see what people are searching there. Or you could, like they have blocked it now, but yeah. I wrote them an email about it and it was ignored for like 2 months or so. And then a colleague of mine published an article on Golem, then they fixed it a few hours later. But yeah, that was also nice. Then quite often these server status pages are restricted to localhost. So for example, Linux distributions ship a default Apache config where the server status page is, you can access it, but only if you come from localhost. Now, if you know how Tor hidden services work, they run on localhost and then kind of the Tor service connects to them. So if you have such a configuration, then the Tor hidden service, like the visitors look like visitors from localhost. So it shows this server status page. And there were like several cases where the server status page from Tor hidden services was publicly accessible. Yeah. I checked Nginx. They also have a status page, but it's kind of boring. It doesn't have, it only shows server is running, and I think something about the load, but nothing about visitors or anything. So that's not very interesting. But yeah, you can also scan for it. Core dumps. Under Linux and also on some Unix systems, it's a standard feature that if a process crashes, then it writes down the memory of the process in a core dump file. So yeah, so application crashes, core dump file gets written. This is default in the kernel, but it depends kind of on the kernel setting and the sysctl option and on your limits conf. So there are a number of things that influence this, but at least in the kernel itself, it's the default and depends what your Linux distribution configures, whether that actually happens or not. And the default file name of these files is core. PHP actually crashes quite often. So there are a number of bugs in PHP that can crash it, where the upstream developers say, we don't fix them because it's too complicated to fix this. I have a repository with such examples. You can check that. You can also use that to test if on your web server, if it crashes, if it writes a core dump. And yeah, of course, you can download core dumps. Yeah, there are a couple of hundred web pages in the Alexa top 1 million. FTP configuration files. There was a blog post by the company Sucuri. They're like a web security company in 2012, so quite a while ago, that they scanned for this sftp-config.json. This is a configuration file from Sublime FTP. I did the same scan in the Alexa 1 million. I found about 200 affected. I tried to inform them. And the nice thing is if you have a FTP configuration file that contains the server you connect to via FTP, the username and the password. So that basically gives you full access to that web page. You can completely hijack it. Yeah. And I was wondering if there's something special about Sublime FTP that people upload their configuration files from Sublime FTP. And it turns out no. People using FileZilla or VSFTP, they also upload their config files. So it was roughly equally distributed. So you find all kinds of FTP config files uploaded to web servers. Vim or Emacs? I know it's a very controversial topic. Probably each of you has a very distinct opinion about it. So let's talk about Vim. If you open a file with Vim, then it creates a .filename.swp. It's a swap file and it contains the complete content of the file you're currently editing. And of course, if you do Vim on your WordPress configuration file, wp-config.php, then it creates a file .wp-config.php.swp. And PHP usually works like that. The web server, if a file has the extension .php, then it gets parsed, and if it doesn't, then it doesn't get parsed. So you can download these files. They get removed if you exit Vim, but if it crashes or gets killed, then they stay there. And yeah, it's extremely common. I found thousands of those. So yeah, you can try to download WordPress configs, and of course also configuration files like config.php, index.php, all kinds of other common file names from PHP where you might find interesting information. And what you usually find is database credentials, but sometimes also I figured out that there seem to be some WordPress plugins that require your FTP credentials in your WordPress configuration file. So sometimes you also get directly the FTP credentials. Many other editors do something else that's also interesting. They create backup files by default. So they just create a file with tilde at the end, or some also create .back, but most of the modern editors use this tilde at the end. And of course, the very same thing happens. These files can be downloaded because it's no longer a .php extension, so you can also search for them. And very same impact as the Vim thing. By the way, for the Vim thing, I was wondering on my own servers, how do I fix this? And it was a bit tricky because I could set the path that they get written to temp, but then I have another problem because they are world writable, so users could then you have a temp file attack. So there's really no easy way within Vim to fix this, and I think it should be fixed now. Yeah. So ideally, it would create these swap files in the temp directory, but only readable and writable for the user that's opening them.
Not to write them at all.
Yeah, or not write them at all. I'm not sure how important they are for the functionality, but yeah. Database dumps, and here it got really scary. This is the MySQL documentation for the tool MySQL dump. If you want to export a complete database, you can use MySQL dump, and in the example they use the file name dump.sql. And of course people tend to copy paste stuff from the web, so many people also save their database dumps as dump.sql. And of course some people save them in their web root, because why not? For example, the German Postal Service, they have a web page umziehen.de, where you can go if you're moving to a new flat. You can tell them, yeah, here's my old address, here's my new address, and please inform my telecom provider and my electricity provider and all the others who might send me things about my new address. And 200,000 of those addresses, the old and the new one, were available as a dump.sql file on their web server. Yeah. Split, do you know the tool Split? Who knows, like, hands up? Nobody? Okay, very few. So Split is a standard Unix tool which you use if you have a very large file and maybe you want to transmit it over a not so reliable channel, then you can split it into maybe 100 megabyte chunks and then transfer it. And it creates the standard file names of the output are XAA, XAB, XAC, and so on. So you can search for that. And the interesting thing is, as this tool is usually used for very large files, you'll find very large things. And of course, then you can also download the other parts like XAB and so on. And I found a database from an Australian online pharmacy with 600,000 addresses, including what they have ordered, which is kind of sensitive data. Yeah. Magento. Magento is the kind of standard open source shop system in PHP. And they do something, they have a configuration file in XML, which is unusual for a PHP application, because usually PHP applications have configuration files in PHP files because they are parsed by the server and not directly given to the user. So this XML file usually can be downloaded. So what do? They have an htaccess file, which prevents access to that configuration. Now, htaccess is a feature of Apache HTTPD. It's not a general web server feature. And Magento also runs on Nginx. So what happens if you run Magento on Nginx? Of course, you can download the configuration file, which contains the database credentials. Yeah. I reported that. They told me that this has already been reported. Then I asked whether they'll fix it and when they'll fix it, and I didn't get an answer to that. Yeah, I don't know. Private keys. So, of course, all the web is moving to HTTPS, so we have to handle certificates and private keys. And of course, some people think it's a good idea to publish their private keys on their web page. This is the most common scheme, so I tried several things. I searched for server key and I think private.key, but the most common one was they were using their own domain name .key. And the reason for that is that's just what is used in the most common tutorials you find if you Google for creating certificates. Yeah, that's. So interesting here is that certificate authorities, there are the so-called baseline requirements, which is a kind of rule book for how certificate authorities should operate. And they say that if a private key for a certificate is compromised, then it should be revoked. And then, because like these CAs operate so-called OCSP servers where you can query whether a certificate is still valid. And if a key is compromised, they're supposed to revoke a certificate within 24 hours. They usually do that, but they usually are not as fast. So usually it takes them a few days. And sometimes some pressure. Interesting here is that, let's say you have a private key, but it doesn't necessarily match the certificate of the site where you downloaded it. But it may still be a private key for some other site. And you can use certificate transparency, which is a system where most HTTPS certificates, and soon it will be all, are logged in a public append-only log. And there's also a search engine for it where you can create a hash of the public key and then search if there are certificates matching that key. So that's very helpful for that. Now the question is, if you're a certificate authority and someone says here is a compromised private key, then how do you actually check that this key matches a certificate? And now we have to learn some crypto, but don't be scared, it will be very easy. In the end, a cryptographic key is just some large numbers. So, and if we take RSA, which is the commonly used algorithm for HTTPS, then a public key is two numbers. They are called N and E. You don't have to know what they mean. It's just two numbers. And the private key is N, E, D, and some more numbers. That's mostly redundant, so you can usually, if you have one of these numbers, you can calculate the others. But for performance reasons, they are all stored in the private key because that allows some optimizations. Now, okay, so in the end, yeah, RSA public key is two numbers and an RSA private key is the same two numbers and some other numbers. That's all you need to know. So if you're a certificate authority and someone reports a compromised key, like saying here, hey, here under HTTPS www something private key, there's a private key and it belongs to the certificate. So yeah, you could compare this N and E from the private key and the public key. Do you think this is a good idea? Some are shaking their heads. So, because what you could do is create a, which someone has called a Franken key, where you say, okay, you take the public values from a public key and then just add some bogus private key values. So we end up with a key that kind of looks like a private key belonging to a public key, but isn't. And I tried that and uploaded such a key. I didn't upload it to a web server, I uploaded it to Pastebin. And then I also found some other keys that were real private keys to real certificates. So I kind of could send them a list, and my Franken key was hidden within the list. And Symantec actually revoked that certificate belonging to that key. Yeah. Here's an OpenSSL command how you can check a private key. And if you do that and then compare the values, then you're kind of safe, because that checks if the internal values make sense of the key. Yeah. Abandoned domain takeover. That was so. Someone contacted me. They had a problem with their WordPress blog. That the layout looked broken, and I looked into it, and what had happened was that they were referencing a font from a third-party server, and this third-party server had deleted that font file. It was easy to fix. I downloaded the font file from Internet Archive, and then I stored it locally and changed the reference, and then it worked again. But it gave me an idea, like. So let's, in this example, just look at the web pages itself, and let's see. It's extremely common in the web today, of course, that web pages include third-party content, like for example a Facebook button or a YouTube video or Google Analytics, all kinds of things. Like it's totally normal that people include some third-party JavaScript in their web page, or other things like images, fonts, whatever. And then, of course, like, what happens if you include some JavaScript from a service and then that service stops to operate? Because, I mean, it's the internet, companies come and go, and yeah. So I thought, okay, I could scan web pages and then check all the domains in the source references if they still resolve. And if they don't, then I can look at that. Does any one of you know Yahoo Analytics? I also didn't know it. It was shut down in 2012, so it probably was not that successful. But Flickr still included their code in June this year, which is kind of funny because Flickr is also a company by Yahoo, so it seems the people at Flickr didn't know that Yahoo Analytics was shut down, although it was in the same company. This was a harmless example because like the domain still belonged to Yahoo, so nobody was serving anything there. But it caused maybe a bit of longer loading times. And when I'm now making fun of Yahoo, I also figured out that on my own blog I had included a pivot script from a subdomain that I had deleted many years ago. So yeah, happens. But then I found a couple of web pages with this, and then it became interesting. So this was including some JavaScript from a domain called piviclionshare.azurewebsites.net. Now Azure Websites is from Microsoft Azure, which is Microsoft's cloud service. So I had a non-existing Azure subdomain. And the nice thing is you can create a free Azure account. So I could register that subdomain for free. And like at first I only looked at the log files and looked at the referrers, so I could know which web pages were including it. And it was a couple of dozen web pages, and they were mostly US newspapers, like local newspapers from throughout the country. And most of them belonged to 2 IP addresses from the same company. So I contacted their abuse department and said, yeah, you should better remove that code. They didn't answer, but they removed the code. So that's kind of fine. But the most prominent user was a newspaper called the Saarland Courier, and this was not on these 2 IP addresses. And this had the most hits. I tried to contact them via email over multiple contacts. Like first I tried some kind of their technical contact, and then I tried their chief editor and their second chief editor, and nobody answered, and the code remained there. And so I thought, okay, but I have another way to contact them, right? Because they are loading my JavaScript. So I did this. I'm not sure if you can read this. So here it says, "Dear operators of the Saline Courier webpage, sorry for this flashy announcement, but I saw no other way to get your attention. Your webpage has a security problem, which includes code from and so on." So that got their attention. Thanks. A couple of hours later, their webpage looked like this. So it seems they were trying to fix it. Then it looked like this. It says fatal error equal to undefined function user access, whatever. Then it looked like this again. So, yeah, but like in the evening, they had managed to fix it and the code was gone. But I never heard, like, they never tried to contact me personally. Yeah. There's another newspaper, the Columbia Missourian, and you can just Google their webpage, and if you go on any of their articles, they have a link, report an error below, and if you click on that, you can still see, yeah, what I did to them. There, because that's now been several weeks, I have increased the annoyance level a bit. I have now added some sound. Yeah. Okay. But this was like when you include code from a domain that's just gone. But I'm wondering, like, it's very common that when a domain is gone, that someone else registers it. So, this was a code I find quite often on web pages from a company called Compete. It seems they provided some kind of web analytics service, and they ended their operation in 2016. And now, of course, what I could do now is check how long they will keep their web page up, because it's a company that no longer exists. Probably at some point they will stop paying their domain registration bills and it will become available. And probably someone else will grab that domain name, because compete.com is kind of a common domain name. So someone else will own it at some point, and there are a lot of web pages out there that still include their code that's no longer there. So yeah, it's kind of what I said. So kind of the moral of the story, like if you include other people's code in your web page, then other people can execute code in your web page, and you should be aware of that. And so in general, I would say if you don't have to, then you should avoid doing that. So many people like include standard things like jQuery or images or stuff where it's really not necessary to include third-party content. I know that people do this because it's cached from the CDNs, but yeah, it's not a big performance issue, and even though then sometimes it may be even faster if you deliver it yourself, because then it can go through one connection. And also, of course, remove unused or obsolete code. Like if you've used a web analytics tool and if you don't notice when they stop operating, then you're probably not using that tool, right? So if you have like JavaScript code that you're no longer using, you should remove it, of course. And if you include third-party content, you should at least know who those people are whom you are allowing to execute code in your web page and whether you can trust them. And you should at least know them well enough to notice when they end their business. Because like, if you trust them, you should know a little bit about them. So at some point I thought, okay, there's HTTP GET, but there are also other HTTP methods. So what happens if we play with them? But unfortunately, I cannot talk about that because there are bugs that are not yet public. But it was interesting. During all these things, I've developed my own scan tool, so I didn't really use wget. I have to admit that. And right now it's just called leaks. It will get another name before I release it, and I can just show you. I run it on my own server because I put all kinds of crap there to test my tool. So you can see, yeah, okay, it found an SQL dump, it found an XAA file, it found a WSFTP. So, yeah, of course I want to publish this at some point, but I need to polish it a bit more. But yeah, so when I did these scans, usually like I used my own self-written tool. I usually scanned the Alexa top 1 million list, which is a list of popular web pages, which is available for free. It's a bit questionable how reliable that data is. Like they say it's the most popular top 1 million web pages. I doubt that a bit and I question their methodology, but it's just a list of web pages that is easy to get and that you can test. And I'm using GNU Parallel, which is a tool where you can like execute the same tool with command line parameters, and then you can say like I want to run 200 processes in parallel and I want to have a timeout, and you kind of have to play a bit with the parameters what is most efficient, because like you can run a lot of requests at the same time. Yeah. So the tool itself, it's a Python 3 script, and my goal is a bit like I want it to be easy to use, because I feel many vulnerability scanners are like, if you know OpenVAS, it's like you have to run a server and then you have to generate a certificate and a database, and it's really annoying to get that running. So I want to have something that is easy to use. So it should just be tool name, server name, and it will give you some interesting output. And I also only want to scan for issues where I really know that they happen in the wild, because there are other tools that are just scanning for a lot of things which are completely hypothetical and which never have been seen in the wild, and then it takes really long and you don't get any interesting output. So I want to scan for things where I know they really happen and that have a very high impact. So it scans for all the issues I mentioned in the talk and a couple of more, and I will soon release it, and of course under free license. Yeah. One thing you will discover if you do things like this, that you get abuse mails. Because like, for example, this Git thing, it's in many IDS systems, they trigger an alarm if you scan for it. And so you get mails like this, which is from the Korean Financial Institute, I think. We are seriously considering notifying these illegal attempts to the related authorities of both your and our countries and request proper legal actions. Then this year they said, the infrastructure of Wuri Financial Group is classified as National Security Objective Facility Class A, and unauthorized access to this facility is strictly prohibited by related laws and regulations. Therefore, this access trial will be regarded as an illegal attack against foreign nationals' critical infrastructure. So, I mean, I kind of understand that people do abuse handling and try to inform people, but I really feel some people are kind of overreacting. And also, like when I do the scans, what I usually do is that I run a web server on that system where I serve a web page which just says, yeah, I'm doing scans for research here, and if you have any questions about that, contact me. And like these mails are automated. Nobody has looked at that, and I kind of feel that this is I feel that this shouldn't be done. Like if you're sending out abuse mails, you should be reasonably sure that there's something real and you're not just annoying people who are doing research. Then disclosure. Of course, you have the problem that you did such a scan and then you know, okay, there are 4,000 pages with their WordPress configuration public. What do you do? Because you cannot contact them manually. And kind of the best thing I got until now is that there's a service called AbuseX, which gets you the abuse contact of an IP through various means. You can query that via DNS, so you can automate it and then kind of group the reports and send them out. And that worked reasonably well, so I had the feeling like a lot of people were reading these abuse reports and were acting on them. So then I also tried to inform national certs. So the Austrian cert has a service where you can query the cert contact for IP address. So they will then do a geo-IP lookup and look which cert is active in that country. The results there were very mixed. Many ignored it, but some were also quite active, that they were trying to reach out to the providers and get them to fix these things. And in severe cases, I try to contact them individually. For example, like when I have these databases with gigabytes of personal customer data, I feel I cannot disclose this publicly before they get taken down, and then I try to contact them directly to get this down as fast as possible. Yeah, some takeaways. So, plenty of stuff ends up on web servers that shouldn't be there, and it seems like this is really an underappreciated problem. And also, sometimes the simple attacks are the best. So this is a really trivial issue, right? I mean, everyone gets the idea. Yeah, there are files and you can download them, but it seems the impact is very massive, as you've seen. Like many examples where you could have taken over web pages, or where you had lots of personal data that shouldn't be public. And also, if you have any ideas what else could be scanned for, then please talk to me. I'm very interested. I can also run these scans, and if it's interesting, I will also add it to my tool. So yeah, I would be very interested if people have interesting ideas what else can be scanned for. By the way, you can also check your server logs if other people are scanning for things that could be interesting to scan for. Yeah, that's it. Thanks for listening, and do you have questions?
Yeah. Any questions?
Henrik?
I think it's really nice that you scan for this, and there's a lot of other services doing scans like this. Have you considered persuading some other researchers to join you? And where did you scan from your own server? Do you pay for?
Yeah, I scanned from my own server. I actually, so I wasn't sure if I should include that in the talk, but I'll just tell it now. Like I had a server at Hetzner, which is a German hosting company. And I actually also figured out that Hetzner had their WordPress database publicly available, which of course I told them, and I thought they would be thankful, but a couple of weeks later they disabled my server because of all these abuse mails. I didn't, that's so nice. I now have a server at OVH, but I also have an offer for a company who might sponsor me a server. I mean, I have written about most of these things publicly, so other people can of course also scan for them. And would also be an option to just scan more domains, because I just scanned the Alexa top 1 million and there are many sources to get more domains. So yeah. I'm totally open to cooperation with other people, and I'm making available what I do, and I'll publish a tool, so yeah.
I have IPs that you can borrow. You can borrow
Okay.
/24 for this.
Yeah. Actually, that is also interesting. This database thing, I found requests in my web server logs that people were trying to download dump.sql, and then I looked what IPs they are, and one belonged to Henrik Ramsö. But it turned out you're running Tor nodes, so yeah. But first I was a bit surprised.
It wasn't me personally.
Yeah.
Maybe later.
Okay. No more questions. Let's give a big hand.